you all so much for coming out this morning when it's so cold. I didn't really pack for this, so I see some of you were much smarter than I was when it came to packing this weekend. But we're going to talk about the natural home dairy during this hour. We'll start out with telling you a little bit about who I am and what we do. I used to be a reporter in the Chicago suburbs, and in 2002, we moved out to the country to start growing our own food organically. And for those of you who've been talking about this for a long time, don't despair. We talked about it for 9 years before we did it. One of the things was I wanted our children to grow up in the country because I thought that it would provide them with a really rich childhood. And one day in 2002, I said to my husband, we started talking about this when Margaret was 5. She's 14 now. There's not much growing up time left. So in 2002, we got really serious. It went from looking at one piece of property every couple of years to really looking at a lot of property, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And we finally found a place. I didn't know anything about goats or cows or sheep. My livestock experience consisted of 2 cats and a poodle. So if you don't know any of this, don't worry, you can learn it. We currently milk about 12 goats. We milk year-round. It's funny because the first year I said that I was going to dry up the goat. I only had 1 goat I was milking. We bought 3 goats, but one of them was in milk. And I was going to dry her up when it got cold so that I wouldn't be milking, out in the winter. And so I did. And then I went back to buying milk at the store and yogurt at the store. And after 6 or 7 months of fresh milk, you can't go back. So that's the only time that we purposely did not milk 12 months a year. And then a couple years ago, I was a bit optimistic in my breeding schedule and thinking that I could get everybody freshening in a good time because you don't milk the last 2 months of pregnancy. And so I had about 2 weeks between the time that my last goat dried up and the time that one kidded. And it was a horrible 2 weeks as I was going into the grocery stores, like reading all the labels and then, well, I'm not buying anything from them because even though that says organic, I know they're being sued right now for not following the organic standards. And so my kids really did not like going to the grocery store with me at that time. So pretty much all of our goats now are Nigerian dwarf. We have had La Manchas and mini Manchas in the past. Mini Manchas are a hybrid. They're created by using a Nigerian dwarf buck and a La Mancha doe. So if you're ever going to make a hybrid, you always want to have the big goat be the doe. Because if you do it the other way around, you can have some serious birthing complications with the does trying to give birth to kids that are way bigger than what nature intended them to give birth to. The reason that we stick with the Nigerians is because our main goal is cheese. The La Manchas give more milk, but their butter fat is much lower. So if you want to make cheese, Nigerians give you a lot more bang for your buck because their butter fat averages around 6%, whereas your large goats are going to average around 3 or 4%. Your Nubians will be around 4, and most of the other ones are going to be like 2.5 to 3.5. And we produce 100% of our own cheese, buttermilk, and yogurt now. We also make butter with our goat milk. We have a cream separator. Goat milk is, a lot of books say it's homogenized. It's not 100% homogenized. You will get some cream separation naturally, but it takes a while. And I'm really picky now about my milk. I really don't like it much after 2 or 3 days. It starts to taste like store-bought milk. So I don't want to wait for it to naturally separate, so that's why we bought a cream separator. And so we make our own sour cream and butter and things like that as well. And we've also milked our cows and sheep. We have Irish Dexter cows and Shetland sheep. And I may be the only person in America that has ever milked a Shetland sheep. If any of you know what a Shetland sheep is, they're about knee high. They're raised primarily for their wool. And I milked them one year. I milked 2 ewes for 2 days, morning and night, and got a quart of milk. So at that point, I really didn't want to continue doing that. I'm like, wow, so it's going to take me 8 days to get a gallon. So I thought, I had heard that sheep yogurt was really good, so I made yogurt with it, and it was absolutely outstanding. It was delicious. So milking sheep is definitely a possibility. Why do people do this? I actually have an hour-long presentation at 1 o'clock this afternoon that goes into great detail about why people are more interested in growing their own food and making things from scratch now. But this is just a quick rundown of the reasons. Health, because a lot of people eating processed foods, genetically modified foods, all those things, people have a lot of health concerns. Safety, we've got all the food recalls and stuff. It's kind of funny, if you've been to any of the raw milk sessions, I'm sure you've heard all about that situation, but it kind of drives you crazy that you see all of the recalls that come through for pasteurized dairy products. And so it's not like pasteurizing it in a factory environment is a guarantee. Because when you have a system that big, there's just going to be room for error. So when you're doing it yourself, if a goat puts her foot in the bucket, that is now pig feed or chicken feed or something. I'm not going to hesitate to dump it because we're consuming it ourselves. So I'm going to be way more careful than some minimum wage employee who's working in a 30,000 cow dairy and happens to drop an inflation in a pile of manure. The ethics of the whole thing, it's really sad. When you raise animals and you get to know animals, you care about them, you realize that they are sentient feeling beings. And it just drives you crazy to think that in the factory farm situation that their needs are not being met. The most basic needs in the world. So the quality and taste is amazing with fresh food. If somebody would have told me before I had my own goats or cows or anything that I'd be able to tell the difference between, fresh milk that was, done milk today or tomorrow or yesterday versus milk that was a week old, I'd have been like, silly, no. But you can. I realized I had passed over into the real world of food snobbery one day when I said, well, I guess I can use yesterday's milk in my coffee. It's kind of funny the things you hear coming out of your mouth after a couple of years of doing this. The other thing is variety. We make cheeses now that I had never even eaten before, and we were a big cheese family. We were vegetarians for 14 years before we moved out to the country, mostly because of the ethics and health issues related to eating factory farmed animals and animal products. And so we did eat a lot of cheese, but now we get a ton more variety from the dairy products that we make ourselves. One of the things that we make is Getust, which is a Scandinavian brown cheese. It is absolutely heavenly. I only make it when we have company coming because it's so rich that you really can't eat a lot of it or you'll make yourself sick. It's kind of like a cross between cheese and fudge. And then the last reason is simply that it is fun. I've got a picture there of the first brie I ever made, and if you're looking at that and going, that doesn't look like any brie I've ever seen, that is the point. Joel Salatin said yesterday, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing poorly at first. And I could not agree more. Every single thing I do well today, we did very poorly at first. And brie is not supposed to have this stuff oozing out of it when you cut it open. It's a pretty soft cheese, but it's not liquid. And but this is what my first brie looked like. And my husband, I failed over and over again with cheddar. And then I finally said to my husband, you know what, you're an engineer. You thrive on being exact and stopwatches and temperatures and all this stuff. You're the one that should be making the cheddar because it's much more picky, far less forgiving than the soft cheeses. And once I talked him into it and he started making it, his first cheddars weren't so great either, but at least they were edible. And we took notes on it and everything. And recently, I'm we have a little cheese tasting every time we open a new round of cheddar or Gouda or Parmesan or something. And when he opened that, a recent one, and we were eating it, and I'm rolling my eyes back in my head and oohing and awing and saying, this is as good as any professional gourmet artisan cheddar I've ever had. And when he pulled out his cheese book to make the notes on our cheese tasting, I said, let's look back at the beginning and see what we said on the first cheddars that you made. And it said, a little dry. And I laughed. It wasn't a little dry. It was kind of like, cheddar flavored sand. It was really, really dry. And, doesn't melt. That's right. It didn't melt at all. So, don't think that you're going to do it perfectly the first time. But you know what? When you have to work for something and you have to keep trying to make something really good, then when you do get it good, it's so exciting and you're so happy and it's so rewarding. So the reason that I talk about this is because I had to learn an awful lot of things the hard way, and I don't think that anybody should have to repeat my mistake. So I talk about these things and I write about these things so that other people don't have to do the same things I did incorrectly, and also to encourage people. One thing is that commercial dairies take all the babies away from their moms at birth, and so a lot of people think that that's how you have to do things. I've gotten emails from people that have asked me this. It's like, I'd really like to produce my own dairy products, but I've heard that you have to take the babies away from their moms at birth, and I really don't feel right doing this. Can I still get milk from them if I don't do that? And the answer is yes, absolutely, you can. And so I realized that there was an audience out there for the way I was doing things, because all of the moms on our farm raised their own babies, and I realized that there were other people out there that wanted to do the same thing, but there really wasn't information out there because, the professionals in the books all said that, you take the babies away from the moms and you bottle feed them, and that you do that for a couple reasons. One is for disease prevention, and the other one is to make them friendly. As far as disease prevention goes, if the mom's not sick, the baby's not going to be sick. So if you've got a healthy mom, then you're going to be okay as far as having healthy kids. In fact, your kids are actually going to be healthier, or calves or sheep. And then there's this misconception that you have to bottle feed babies to make them friendly, which kind of makes me chuckle now, because friendly is a very subjective term. Some people say that it makes them friendly. I say it makes them bratty and annoying. I don't like goats and calves jumping on me and rubbing on me and trying to suck on my fingers. And the biggest problem with goats especially is that I did wind up having to bottle feed a lamb once because it got fly strike. And so the biggest problem that I have with dam-raised goats or bottle-raised goats is that they don't have any herd instinct and they do not respect fences. So you see a lot of really negative stuff written about goats and fencing and how they're the hardest animals to keep fenced. The reality is, if you don't have the right fence up there, every animal is hard to keep fenced. Whether it's a cow or a pig or whatever, you just have to have the right fencing. However, when goats are bottle fed, they are the most incredible escape artists you have ever seen in your life, because they don't have the instinct to stay with the goats. They want to be with the people. And so they will do whatever they can they will find cracks that you didn't know existed, like the crack between the gate and the post that it's attached to. So that is one thing I really don't like much about them. The advantages of dam raising are that the kids know their kids, calves know their calves, and lambs know their lambs. The lamb that I wound up having to bottle feed because of fly strike, she was very, very weak. She was so sick when we found her that she couldn't even stand. So that's why we had to bring her inside. And after a couple days, I tried taking her back out. And her mother immediately recognized her and came running to her, but she didn't recognize her mother. So I wound up having a bottle-fed lamb forever. And she did not know she was a lamb. She had zero flocking instinct. And flocking is a prey animal's best defense against predators. And I knew that because of her lack of a flocking instinct that, if coyotes got in, she was going to be the first to go because she was going to be off on her own and she wasn't going to be running with the rest of the sheep. And sure enough, that is what happened. She was just under a year old when the coyotes got her. Babies keep up a mom's milk supply while you're learning to milk. I've seen this happen way too many times where somebody is brand new to milking and they hear that they need to separate the moms and the babies. And if you don't know how to milk and you're not emptying that udder, it's not going to keep filling up. It's all a matter of supply and demand. So if nobody's demanding, her body's not going to supply. So you can have an animal dry up in fairly short order if you're not getting her milked out. And somebody, was calling me once and saying, like, well, we're just having, this goat's just not producing. And, like, I had just sold her to them and she was in milk. And so I said, they didn't live very far away. So I said, well, come on over and we'll see how you're doing. Because I said, well, you're not emptying her if that's all you're getting. Because we were milking her and we were getting a lot more. So I said, well, come over and we'll see. And they came over and the guy milked a goat. And he's like, she's empty. I'm sure she's empty. And I'm like, okay. My daughter sat down. She got a couple more cups out of her. And, these people were just standing there going, I don't know how you got all that milk out of her. And it's like, that's because she's been milking for, 5 years. So now I actually will not sell an animal in milk to somebody who doesn't have milking experience unless they are sold with a kid that's nursing, because I don't want to get those kind of phone calls anymore. And I really encourage people that if they're raising their own animals to leave the kids or calves on and let them nurse. And then, so that way if you're not getting them milked out, you put them back with the baby finishes and keeps up that milk supply. Yeah?
One method that I use, I dam raise all my goats also.
Uh-huh.
Is I separate them at night all in one pen, all the kids together. And I'll milk them once in the morning, get everything from the mom, and then the kids can have them for the rest of the day. And that's worked out very well for me. So I get what I need and the kids get what they need. And then just to add, I'm not trying to.
Actually, that is exactly what I'm going to cover in a couple more slides, so you just jumped way ahead of me. Because people always ask that, they're like, well, how do you do it? And so I am going to cover that in just a minute.
Sorry.
That's okay. So in addition to having, so best case scenario, if you're not getting a mother empty, the best case scenario is that her supply is just going to go down. Worst case scenario is that she could wind up with mastitis. For 9 years, we never had a single case of mastitis in any of our goats. And then the first case of mastitis we had was in a doe that we separated from her kids, and after 24 hours, she had mastitis. And then we've had a couple more since then, and they were all in does, and they were both in does that had kids that were not nursing. So, because when you're milking, you're only able to empty that udder every 12 hours in most cases. Whereas the kids are constantly emptying it. So, that's where me and the bottle raising people differ. They think that, you're going to have a healthier doe if you're bottle raising. I say you're going to have a healthier doe if you're dam raising. Because nature intended for that udder to be constantly emptying, not for milk to sit in there for 12 hours at a time and only be emptied twice a day. It also gives antibodies in the baby to the babies. You can't. Most of the people who bottle raise will pasteurize the milk before they feed it to the babies because of their concern for disease. And so if you do that, you're killing some antibodies in the milk. And so I find between extremely good, good barn hygiene, which that might sound like an oxymoron. But my opinion is if I'm not willing to go in there and sit down, it's not clean enough for kids. So it needs to have some more fresh straw put on it. There shouldn't be a lot of poop sitting around on top of the straw. Because coccidia is the main issue that kids will have when they're little. And coccidia is such a problem in bottle babies that they sell milk replacer that's medicated so that the kid is getting medication with every bottle to prevent that disease. In them. And coccidia is a really bad problem with bottle babies. They get diarrhea and they can wind up dying fairly quickly from all that fluid loss when they get the diarrhea. So the antibodies in the mother's milk make for much healthier babies. My doe kids that I keep are never weaned. I have doe kids out there 6 months old, still nursing. It really can surprise people who bottle feed about how big and healthy my kids get and how quickly they get that big and healthy. There was a man, I absolutely positively will not sell a kid before 8 weeks. I don't care what you say to me. And there was a man who just argued with me until he was blue in the face, trying to get me to sell a kid to him at 6 weeks. And I absolutely said no. And I said, you know what, if you don't care more about the health of my goat than that, I'm not going to sell her to you. And then he backed off. So he came and got her then when, because I said I prefer to keep them for 3 months, but 2 months is my absolute bottom. I mean, I don't go any lower than, not going to go any lower than that. So he came and got her at 3 months, and when he saw her, he was absolutely shocked at how big she was compared to his 3-month-old kids at home that were bottle fed. And it's just because they're getting all those antibodies and stuff so their body can put all of its energy into growing instead of fighting off bugs. Dam raising also provides more flexibility for humans. A lot of people are concerned about having dairy animals because they don't want to be tied down to twice a day milking 365 days a year. And when you dam raise your kids, you don't necessarily have to milk every single animal twice a day. Right now we are milking, we have 5 goats that have to be milked twice a day because those 5, either all their kids were sold or the bucks, or they had bucks which need to be separated before they reach sexual maturity so that they're not running around impregnating everybody. But other than that, the other goats, we can just milk them once a day. We can separate their kids overnight and milk them in the morning if we want. Or if we don't have time to milk a dozen goats, then we don't have to. We just leave the kids with them and the kids keep up the milk supply and we can take what we want when we need it. To get started with your whole dairy, you need a couple of dairy animals. I emphasize the fact that you need a couple because all these animals are herd animals. And they're not really going to be as happy and healthy as they could be if there's only one of them. A lot of people think of the family cow. But the fact is, that historically, the family cow was usually not alone. She usually had a calf with her. So, and you know, a calf can nurse for a really long time. We butchered a couple of bulls last year that were 10 months old, and they were still out there. We'd still see them nursing sometimes. So they were 100% grass and milk fed at 10 months. We took them away one day, and then a couple months later, Mom had more babies. So you need so these need to have a friend. And really, when you're talking about goats and sheep, they're very small, and it's not any harder to take care of 3 or 4 than it is to take care of 1 anyway. Goats especially are insanely picky about their water. If there's anything in that water, they're not going to drink it. And people used to tell me this, and I didn't believe it. But then I started testing it, and I'm like, okay, that water bucket's still full. I'm going to leave it there till tomorrow morning and see. I go back tomorrow morning, it's still at the same level. So that night I empty the water bucket, and it's down 3 or 4 inches the next morning. So they really do have an aversion to water that's not fresh and clean. So you're going to have to empty that bucket and refill it, whether there's 1 in there or a lot more. When you choose which species you want to think about size. If you're like us and your experience consists of dogs and cats, you probably don't want anything really huge. I chose Irish Dexters because they were the smallest breed. In fact, if you look at all the animals we have, we should have just called ourselves miniature acres because I wound up getting the smallest breed of everything. However, I learned fairly quickly that if you and a cow have a disagreement, really not a big difference between an 800-pound cow and a 1,500-pound cow as far as who's going to win. You can't really win an argument with an 800-pound cow any easier than you can with a 1,500-pound cow. So if you're gonna get a cow, you want to get one that is already trained if you're new to all of this, because it can be very challenging and really just a crapshoot. You know, are you gonna get a cow that's friendly enough to let you milk her if she's never been milked before? And the first 2 cows that we bought, oh boy, whew. That's a whole fun story in itself. And we've got a couple of cows now that we bought, and one I can milk and one I can't milk. So, it's kind of a challenge. So in many ways, it would be better to get like a nice Jersey that somebody had, like if you happen to have an organic dairy near you that has a Jersey that's not milking enough anymore for them to meet their needs. Although I tell you, a lot of organic dairies are very resistant to get rid of any milk cows, even if they're old and don't produce much anymore. Because I called around as much as I could and I couldn't find one. So finding a good milk cow is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. You want to think about the milk. There's an old Spanish saying that you get butter from the cow, milk from the goat, and cheese from the sheep. And that really pretty much sums up some of the best uses for those milks. Cow milk is really great to make butter with because it naturally separates. You put cow's milk in a bowl overnight and you go in there in the morning and you got skim milk on the bottom, you got cream on the top. So you can just scoop it off with a big spoon or a ladle and you can make your butter. The goat milk doesn't really separate much at all, so it's very easy, it's very nice for drinking. I love it for using in my coffee and pretty much anything that you would use milk for. Sheep are seasonal producers. Most sheep breeds are only going to make milk for 4 to 6 months. They're only going to lamb in the spring. There's a couple of breeds that have been bred for dairy production, and so you might get 6 to 8 months of milk production out of them. And so that's good for making cheese, definitely, because you can age your cheese and have that available year-round. But it's a little tougher to get year-round milk production if you have sheep. Buying a dairy animal, when it comes to what you're paying, you get what you pay for. You can't, if you go to a sale barn and get a really cheap animal, you would be the luckiest person in the world if that turned out to be a great dairy animal. Because nobody is going to sell an animal for $50 if they could sell it for $300 or $400 or $800 or $1,000. And like I said, finding a dairy cow that's trained to milk is incredibly hard. There are some small farmers now that are starting to specialize in that, that they keep their heifers, they raise them up, and they calve, and then they teach them to milk, and then they're starting to sell them. There's a man in Iowa who does that with Irish Dexters, and I wish I'd have known about him before I got mine, because it would have been a really good deal to pay a few $100s more to get a cow that was trained to milk. So you should definitely buy from a milking herd. I know when I got started, both with everything, I just thought, I just went out and bought the first animals I found. But a milking herd is going to hopefully have milk records, and we keep records of everything. We're on DHI, which stands for Dairy Herd Improvement. Might not have got on this a long time ago if I would have known that the USDA was going to, have all my records. So you might not want to do that if you don't want to have the government have all your milking records. But now they know where we are, so it's kind of pointless to get off of it. But even if you don't do that, you should keep barn records, because a really good indication that a goat may have any kind of problems is that her milk supply may suddenly drop. If I'm milking my goats every day and I look at the amount of milk they give, and all of a sudden one goat's giving considerably less than she did yesterday, there's a very good chance that there's something off with her. Like she's got a heavy case of worms that's suddenly starting to get to her, something like that. So I want to check her out more thoroughly and see what's happening. And because their milk supply should very gradually decrease. You shouldn't ever see anything really quick. You want to see, udder pictures before you buy animals. It's really funny because when I started, I would look at some websites and I would see pictures like the one up here on the screen. And I thought, those people are demented. Why do they have a picture of other goats' udders up there? Of course they have udders, because I had no idea what I was looking at. So this is an udder of a goat that is a very good producer. This was actually my best producer last year. And she was number one in the American Goat Society's one-day milk test last year. So you can, there are goats that have udders that are going to be half that size, and their milk supply correspondingly will be half as much. You know, they can't hide that milk anywhere. So if they're a really good producer, they're going to have a bigger udder than a goat that's a poor producer. Same thing with cows. And actually with cows, it can get kind of scary when you look at some of the commercial cows. Their udders are way, way too big because they're giving them hormones to increase their supply. So they look bizarrely abnormal. If you're going to be drinking your milk raw, you want to test for diseases before purchase. One of the things that some people think is that Crohn's disease may come from Johne's, which is a ruminant disease, and they say that Johne's is not even killed by pasteurization. So some of the people who have Crohn's may have gotten that just from drinking milk from cows that have Johne's. Johne's kills animals at a very young age, but in a commercial dairy, your cows generally only live about 3 or 4 years because they are being pushed so hard that they're not very healthy. They get stressed out. A family milk cow can be expected to live and produce for 15 years. So you can see the difference that environment and diet and everything can play in the life of an animal. So if you've got an animal with Johne's, because their attitude is, well, pasteurization is going to kill any germs in the milk, so if they're not so healthy, it's not a big deal. If they're going to die pretty young anyway, and Johne's usually kills animals with a couple years after they get it. So they're probably not shortening their lifespan all that much if they have this undetected in their herd. Johne's is a disease that any ruminant can get. So goats and sheep could also get it. And if you ever have an animal on your property that has that, your soil is considered contaminated for at least 5 years. Because it's a fecal-oral contamination. So they poop, they leave the germs there, and then another animal comes along and eats that grass and can get that disease. Because it gets in the soil. And the best answer I've ever been able to get from a vet about how long is they're like at least 5 years before you could safely put ruminants on that land again. With goats, it's also a good idea to either have the goats, if adults. You can't really test kids for CAE and expect to get a good result, or a reliable result. But so if you're buying dam-raised kids, the dams should have tested negative for CAE, or if you're buying an adult, the adults should have tested negative. Buying from a closed herd that has a long history of negative tests is also a possibility. We don't really test much anymore because we have a closed herd. We don't let any new goats come into our farm. We have enough different bloodlines that we're able to keep breeding without inbreeding. And I like that because I know that I have all healthy animals because we drink our milk raw. At least one of you should have some experience milking if you're buying an adult. I think I covered that pretty well already. And then it's a really good idea to milk an animal that's nursing a baby if you're new to milking. So, working with milkers. Some of you may be looking at this first sentence and saying, well, duh, they have to have a baby to make milk. However, there are a lot of people in this world that don't know this. I have had many people call and ask, how do you make a goat make milk? And my favorite phone call of all time was the woman who called and said, do Nigerian dwarfs have to get pregnant and have a baby before they can make milk? And I said, yes, all goats have to get pregnant and have a baby before they make milk. And she said, no, they don't. Real dairy animals don't have to give birth to make milk. And I said, oh, yes, they do. Whoever told you that was mistaken. All dairy animals, cows in commercial dairies are rebred once every year. That's where veal comes from. No, they don't have to get pregnant. I don't want one of those goats, and if you have to get them pregnant to make milk. So I always wondered how many people this woman was going to call before she finally realized that she was misinformed. So after your goat or cow has a baby, they will start to make milk. And at that point then, depending on how many babies she has, how many times she's freshened, how much she's making, you can start to work with that mom and baby. An extremely good milker may make more milk than her babies can consume, but in terms of goats, not usually. I have a picture there of Viola, who was one of my La Manchas, and I thought it was really cute when she first had her babies, and they were like 2 days old, and she wouldn't let them sleep. I would be in the barn, and they would lay down and try to sleep, and she'd go over there, and she'd be nosing them to make them get up, and she'd be pushing them back to her udder, and I'm looking at her and going, wow, that udder is pretty full, and she's not letting these poor kids sleep. So I was able to milk Viola always, anytime. Just go out there, and I could milk her every single day without ever separating her kids, and I could get a quart of milk from her. At her peak, she was producing 2 gallons a day. So if you've got a goat like that, you can certainly milk her like that. If you wanted, you could separate her kids for a few hours if you wanted more milk. But obviously her kids grew up really big and healthy really fast. If a goat has a single kid, you really want to be milking that mom pretty much from day one. Otherwise, you're going to have a fat kid and a low milk supply, because it's all about supply and demand. And so one kid, believe me, they're going to demand as much as they possibly can, but they can only demand so much. So we kind of play around. We do whatever is convenient for us at the time. If it doesn't seem to make a difference with the doe, there are some does that we have just milked twice a day. If we're getting plenty of milk by milking them twice a day, we may just do that, because that way they can just fall in line with other milkers that we might be milking twice a day. Or we may just separate that kid every single night, starting like at about 4 or 5 days of age. Just separate it every night for 12 hours and milk her in the morning. And I say, we're the twin that wasn't born. Because if a baby was bottle fed, it would go 12 hours overnight without a bottle, and the kids seem to do fine with that, because for 12 hours all day long they can nurse as much as they want, and believe me, they do. So if a doe has twins, it totally depends on her as far as when we start milking her. If she is producing, you can, around 2 weeks, you can separate the kid overnight and see how much she's making, and from there you can kind of judge. The numbers that I'm going to quote right now are for Nigerians. But so for example, a Nigerian kid needs a minimum of 24 ounces of milk. So if you separate a doe overnight and you find that she's making 3 pounds of milk, or she's making 24 ounces in 12 hours, that's just the right amount for 2 kids. So you really don't want to take anything until those kids are older. You can check again, like when the kids are like a month old, because her supply should go up. Should peak around 6 to 8 weeks. So you can kind of, every now and then separate overnight, see how much she's making, and based on what she's making, you can either start separating the kids every night, every other night, not at all. Typically, if a doe is nursing triplets or quads, which is kind of pretty common in Nigerians, I usually don't even think about milking the doe unless I'm looking at 1-month-old kids that are really big and fat, and then I might start to separate every couple nights or something like that. With quads, you need a goat that's producing 6 pounds a day for those kids to get enough milk. And that's a lot for a Nigerian. I have does who do that, but if they're making less, then the kids might actually need to be supplemented in that situation. But anyway, so there's no hard rules about when to start or how often to milk. You really have to play it by ear and watch the kids. It can be tough for somebody who is completely new to goats and has just this one set. There was somebody, I have a goat group on Ning, N-I-N-G, and I will give you the address at the end here. But there was somebody on there maybe a year ago who was separating these 1-month-old twins from a first freshener overnight, every night. And I'm like, I don't think there's any first freshener that's going to make enough milk that can give twins what they need in 12 hours. And she's like, oh no, they're fine. Well, if you don't have anybody to compare them to, like, oh, they're growing way slower than these kids over here that are the same age. If you've never raised them before, you don't know how they're supposed to feel, because they need to feel real meaty. You don't want them to feel light. It's like, so you have to kind of do the math and see, like, is it really possible that those kids are consuming what they need in 12 hours? So any question about goats or cows or milking sheep or anything like that, we're going to try to cover cheese making and the basics of cheese and soap making in the next 20 minutes.
Do you ever put your kids on another mother? Like, do they ever adopt?
I haven't needed to do that. She asked about putting kids on another mother. I have not had to do that. I've always been lucky enough to have everybody able to do what they needed to do. I do know a woman, somebody, we all have different degrees of experience. And I got really lucky the first couple years. Everything went just absolutely perfectly for me. There was another woman who bought some goats for me, and her very first kidding season was quite a nightmare. She called me in the afternoon and said, how soon do kids need to nurse after they're born? Because these kids were born this morning and they still haven't nursed. And I said, it had been like 8 hours. Kids need colostrum like ASAP, like within the first hour or two after birth. And I said, if you don't get colostrum into those kids now, they will die. And she tried, and she wasn't able to do anything, and the kids died a few hours later. The next week, she had a kidding experience that is like probably 1 in 1,000. It was really horrible. I was on the phone with her, talking her through it, and a few hours later, the doe died. So now she's got 2 kids with no mom. She's got a mom over here with no kids, and she was able to graft those kids onto that mom. And it was kind of cool because it was grandma. So, so the grandma wound up raising her grandbabies, and so it worked out.
When you separate them at night, are you keeping them adjacent to one another, or?
Oh, that's a really great question. She says, when you separate them at night, do you keep them adjacent to each other? For people who are just getting started and you just have, a few goats, what you can do is put a dog crate in their stall with them overnight, and you put the kids in the dog crate. Especially a wire crate is really great because that way mom has access on all sides, and a lot of times the mom will lay down next to them, and she'll be right there with them. I have not quite figured out how to separate my cows from the calves overnight yet, because remember how I said that any animal is hard to keep fenced in if you don't have the right fencing? About the only thing that cows respect 100% is electric. I tried separating my cows from their calves with a woven wire fence in between, and I come out the next morning and one of the cows was in there with her calf, and the other one wasn't, and of course the one that wasn't was the one that wouldn't let us milk her. So so separating cows is a little bit more of a challenge. You definitely need to have something that is sturdy enough to keep something that mom can't break, as well as not just worrying about the calf getting out. But yeah, if you have them right next to each other, that way it's less stressful for them because they can see each other and everything. Okay. I couldn't hear you at all because of the guy back there.
On a piece of land that had pet goats on it before we got it, is there a soil test that can be run to make sure there's no disease in that soil?
Ah. Okay, she said that they bought a piece of property that had goats on it before. They were pet goats. And is there a soil test that you can do to check for the presence of yonis? Nope, there's not. The best thing you could do at this point is maybe if you still have contact with those people, you could contact them and ask them if their goats were ever tested for disease, and see what they say. Or ask them like, oh, do you still have the goats? Are they still healthy? Yonis usually kills animals within a couple of years. There's a few that can just become carrier typhoid Mary types, but if they had several goats, like 3 or 4 goats, the odds that all of those could be carriers without getting sick is pretty slim. So if you find out about the health of those goats, that would be a pretty good indicator. Yes?
Can you do the test yourself?
The blood tests? Yes, you can. There's a company online called BioTracking, and they have information they have a video there of like a little 12-year-old girl doing a blood draw from a goat's neck. You can get all the supplies from them. You can also, you can get blood draw supplies from a lot of different companies online, and you can also send them into Washington Animal Diagnostic Lab, Washington State, to do the test too. So there's a couple, those 2 labs there that are more than happy to work with the owners, and you can send the blood samples directly to them. Yes?
Wondering if that gets you a flag with disease and for disease control, like people who send in tests and you get the results back. Is somebody else getting those results? Are you sort
It depends on which state you live in, so you could talk to your vet about that. I know that's something that's kind of in the back of my head sometimes. In some states, there are diseases that are considered reportable. There are diseases that are considered actionable. Reportable just means they have to tell the state wants to know and keep track of it. In other states, it's considered actionable, which means they have to do something like put the animal down or whatever. And it varies from disease to disease and state to state.
One thing to keep in mind is that the test for Johne is nowhere near 100%.
Yes.
It's not in the ballpark.
Yeah. That is another thing too. The Johne's blood test is not as accurate as the Johne's fecal test. The fecal test gets cultured for like a couple of months, whereas the blood test is much quicker. The blood test is really much better if you're doing a whole herd test, and because again, Johne's is very contagious. So if you do if you're buying from a herd that has had Johne's tests, they've had like 5 years of negative tests in all healthy animals that have been necropsied after death. You've never had a case of Johne's. The chances of Johne's in that herd is about as close to 0 as you can get, compared to just doing a single test on a single animal out of the blue. So if you were just doing a single test on a single animal out of the blue, it would be better to go for the fecal test because it is more sensitive. But it takes 2 months, which is not something that most people are willing to wait for. Can I wait 2 months to buy this animal if the test comes back positive or negative? So equipment for making cheese is pretty simple. You can start with what you have in your kitchen right now. I'm sure you all have a big pot and a spoon, and that's about in a couple of bowls. That's really all you need to make mozzarella. It really is one of the simplest to make in terms of equipment needed. Queso, blanco, or feta is about the same thing, except you're going to need a cheesecloth to drain it through. Some people will use an old pillowcase or an old handkerchief or some other type of fabric. That also can work. Chev is, you can drain chev through cheesecloth also. That's what we did initially, and then I bought molds. I had read online that you could take old yogurt containers or cottage cheese containers, whatever, and drill holes in them. And so I'm like, I'm going to be thrifty and do that. Those things are meant to be disposable. They're meant to be used once. And so after about 3 batches of yogurt, they were cracking and falling apart and stuff. At which point I said, this is kind of pointless. So I bought the professional molds from the cheesemaking supply place, which will be on the slide at the end. And they are 10 years old and still going strong. They're food grade plastic. They're very heavy duty, and so they last. Mold ripened cheeses like brie and camembert, you need a different type of a mold for them. You use molds that are open on both ends so that you can flip it during the drying process. And then to make aged cheeses, you need the most equipment. You need to have a cheese press, and that press needs to have a pressure gauge on it, or you need to have a way to know how much weight you are putting on it. Because one of the differences, it's really funny, the difference between cheeses is really just in the way that you treat that milk while you're turning it into cheese. And one of the tiny little differences between what becomes Gouda and what becomes cheddar is how much weight it is pressed with. Gouda is, and if you think of, I never thought about this before I made cheese, but Gouda is a little bit softer, a little bit moister. It's only pressed at 20 pounds. Cheddar is a little drier, and it is pressed at 50 pounds. So you need to know how much you're pressing. Otherwise, you're not going to get something. What you get may be wonderful, and it may be edible, and you may love it, and you want to make it over and over again. But it may not be what you're going for when you start it. It may taste like something different. You also need a cave or a place to age your cheese. We built our house on our property, and we built in a cheese cave. And it works great all winter. Unfortunately, during the summer, the temperature in there gets too high for it to be useful. So we've had to, my husband's an electrical engineer, so he jockeyed with the thermostat on a refrigerator and made it so that it will set at 55 degrees. Legally, a refrigerator is not supposed to be able to be any warmer than 40 degrees for food safety reasons. So if you don't happen to have a knack for playing with electronics, you can get a little thing that you plug into the wall that you plug a fridge into to make it stay at a higher temperature. You can also buy these wine refrigerators or beverage refrigerators. The price of those has come down a lot in the last few years. They used to be several $100s for this little refrigerator, but they're down to around $150 now. And one of the things that has kind of slowed us down from making some different mold-ripened cheeses is that if you do mold-ripened cheeses, they're going to need to have a separate aging cave, unless you want a blue cheese cheddar. I've been told blue mold is especially strong and vigorous and will go after anything that is in the same aging area. The ingredients for cheese, of course, you need your milk, and then you will need something to ripen that cheese. And that could be either an acid or a culture. Acid would be something like vinegar or citric acid. You use vinegar for making queso blanco. Citric acid is used to make a quick mozzarella. In my book, Homegrown and Handmade, I have a mozzarella in there that uses citric acid. It only takes you about 20 minutes to make. And then culture is what is used in the vast majority of cheeses that we all eat. All of your aged cheeses use culture. And it's kind of interesting because there's only mesophilic and thermophilic cultures. Mesophilic are worked at a slightly lower temperature. Like your cheeses in the mesophilic area, you prepare those curds at around 90 to 100 degrees, whereas in the thermophilic, you can go a lot higher, even like up to 120, 130. And pretty much with thermophilic, the only thing that uses that is like yogurt and Parmesan and that other one that's just like Parmesan that I can never remember the name of it. The other really dry. Yeah, Romano. That uses the thermophilic also. And then mesophilic is what you use for, your cheddar, your Gouda, and all of those more common cheeses that people eat. You will need rennet for any cheese that you want to melt. So like queso blanco does not have rennet in it, it will not melt. You can stir fry it, and you'll get a crunchy cheese. Mold is what you would need to add if you're going to make a mold-ripened cheese. Like the white mold on brie and camembert is Penicillium candidum. And I just saw my 5-minute thing. So here's a quick recipe for making queso blanco or ricotta, which you can actually find recipes all over the place for this. One thing I will point out here, most recipes will say apple cider vinegar. You can use any kind of vinegar you want. Our personal favorites are like red wine vinegar, because that just makes a really tasty, much tastier cheese than apple cider vinegar, in our opinion. You might prefer the apple cider, though. This is the equipment that you need for making soap. One of the things I will say about this is that you really do need the digital scale. I hesitated for so long about buying that digital scale because I said, well, they didn't have digital scales 1,000 years ago when they were making soap. And the fact is that 1,000 years ago, the quality of their soap varied greatly from one batch to another. There was a letter that John Adams' daughter wrote to her about how she made 3 batches of soap yesterday and only one turned out decent. You really need to know how much lye you're using, right down to the last ½ ounce or quarter ounce. So it's really important to get that digital scale now. And again, I was very early in my homesteading adventure when I did that, and as soon as I bought that scale, I found I used it for everything. I used it for weighing my milk when I brought it in from the barn. I used it for canning. I used it for cooking. So we go through a digital scale now about every 3 years. And then the stick blender, you really do want to use a stick blender because it's going to go way, 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 way faster. I have a friend who was using a spoon. She's been making soap way longer than me, and she's been using a spoon. And a couple of years ago, I finally convinced her to start using the stick blender. The difference between a spoon and a stick blender could be anywhere from a couple hours to 6 or 7 hours of stirring. And I finally talked her into the stick blender when she was up until 3 o'clock in the morning trying to get a batch of soap to finally trace. And I'm like, just try it once. All you need to make soap is oil, frozen milk, and lye, and then everything else is optional. So the ingredients to make soap are really very, very small. If you see somebody that says they're making soap without lye, they're not really making soap, because you have to have something, either sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, to cause saponification. Some people will do what they call melt and pour, and they'll say making soap, but it's not. Somebody else made it. When you see like sodium cocoate on a label, that is saponified coconut oil. It's sodium hydroxide and coconut oil. And I'm sorry, I don't have time to do that. I will go ahead and put this, I'll put this PowerPoint on SlideShare, and then I will post it on my website. So the website is right there at the very top, homegrownandhandmadethebook.com, which may be the world's longest URL because somebody squatted on Homegrown and Handmade and wanted to charge me $2,000 for it. So, so I will put this up on the website within the next couple of days, and so you can get the recipe off of there, the instructions and the recipe for soap. The second link there, NigerianDwarfGoats.ning.com, is my online community for people who have Nigerian dwarfs. We're up to almost 800 really awesome, friendly, wonderful people who have goats on there. And then there's my Facebook page and my book. And then there's a couple of places where you can get supplies for cheese making. Cheesemaking.com caters to the home cheesemaker, so everything is sold in nice small quantities. If you really get into this and you're making lots and lots of it, then you might want to start buying from the Dairy Connection, because they sell in larger quantities. So you have to measure out, like they'll come with a thing like, combine culture with 50 gallons of milk or something like that. So you need to be a little bit more knowledgeable to get your cultures and stuff from them, because they don't give you the customer support that cheesemaking.com does. So I will be more than happy to stick around and answer questions as long as you guys want. It is 11, yes?
Are those on your Facebook page?
Everything, you can find everything through my website. Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much for coming.